This is our second lecture on vision. And last time I emphasized the importance of this slide in the handout because for me the main points in both these lectures have to do with the way that the visual system transforms relatively useless information in images. Useless because it's so distributed across many channels, so implicit, hard to read, and so unstable. And the visual system uses various neural mechanisms to transform that kind of information into information about the real world that's in a compressed form that's much more storable in memory and sendable to other parts of the brain, explicit, easy to read from memory or from other parts of the brain, and stable. That is, it doesn't change, the final representation in vision can't change dramatically when you move your eyes or when something moves in the world. And we talked about the visual system through primary visual cortex, or V1, and we talked briefly about the dorsal pathway. And today we're going to talk about the ventral pathway. Specifically, we're going to talk about a couple of stages in the ventral pathway. First of all, what's called area V4, which is where this arrow is pointing right now, which is still in occipital cortex. Area TEO, which is sort of at the transition between occipital cortex and temporal cortex, and then area TE, which tracks across the ventral part of the temporal lobe in monkeys. Remember that the ventral pathway processes fine shape, texture, color, etc. in order to produce knowledge about what is in the world, so it's called the what pathway. As you progress forward in the ventral pathway, and this is true in the dorsal pathway and true in general in sensory systems, receptive fields get larger. Individual cells are processing more of the sensory sheet, and that's how hierarchical or deep networks work, whether they're biological or artificial. At each successive stage, neurons get input from multiple neurons at the previous layer. And so in vision, that means you're getting input from more of the visual field. Your receptive field is going to get larger, and that fan-in effect compounds as you go from one layer to the next. So at intermediate stage V4, which is one or two synapses away from primary visual cortex, depending on whether the inputs happen to be directly from V1 or go through area V2. In V4, the receptive fields of neurons cover several degrees of visual angle as opposed to fractions of degrees of visual angle near the fovea. And on this scale in the natural world, it's no longer true that that boundaries between regions of different brightness or regions of different color are generally smooth in orientation. They tend to change in orientation on that scale in our natural world. And this explains the major compression strategy in area V4, which is to encode changes in orientation. And the mathematical name for change in orientation is curvature. It's the derivative of orientation. So this figure shows an example of tuning for curvature in an individual V4 neuron that was studied with lots of different shapes. The shape stimuli are the white icons inside all of these circles. And the neuron's response to each of these stimuli in spikes per second, indexed by this scale here, is represented by how dark the background is. So the high response stimuli are the ones with black backgrounds, and the black backgrounds make them easier to see. So you can see that this neuron doesn't respond to any single kind of shape. One of the early ideas about neurons in visual cortex was that every neuron would be a detector for some discrete thing, and it would fire when that thing was present and wouldn't fire without that. So people typically have looked for what is the best stimulus, the shape that drives a cell really well, but in fact there's no single shape that drives this cell well. There are lots of different shapes, all these shapes with black backgrounds, that evoke a very brisk response from this neuron of more than 30 spikes per second. But if you look at this long enough, you'll realize that there is a common geometric characteristic to the high response stimuli, and that is they have convex curvature. They have an outpocketing near the top of the shape. So all of these shapes with black backgrounds, even though their global shape changes a lot, their common characteristic is sharp convex curvature near the top. And that can be represented with a tuning function, just like orientation tuning in V1 can be represented by a curve. In this case, the function is represented on a plane where this axis, the vertical axis, represents curvature. 0 would mean no change in orientation, so a flat edge would have 0 curvature. Positive numbers represent increasing degree of convex curvature all the way up to a value of 1 here, and based on a transformation, 1 equates to basically as sharp as curvature can get. That is actually a singularity or a discrete break in orientation. And then this axis down here, the horizontal axis, represents the position of a contour fragment that has a particular curvature relative to the rest of the shape. So 0 refers to parts of the shape that are off to the right. 90 refers to parts of the shape that are near the top, 180 off to the left, 270 near the bottom. And the responsiveness of this neuron across all different kinds of contour curvatures and at different positions relative to the center of the object is represented by this heat map plot here. And the peak is at 90, that's the top of the shape, and at 1, that is really sharp convex curvature. And that tallies with what you can see across all of these shapes. So this is a neuron that doesn't represent information about an entire shape. It's representing information about part of a shape. And that's characteristic of a neural coding scheme that was proposed by theorists a long time ago, and is still a popular idea, the idea of configural coding, that objects are represented by the brain as configurations, spatial configurations of their parts. So the idea in configural coding is that individual neurons, again, don't represent information about an entire shape. They represent object parts, for example, a sharp convex point, and their object relative positions, how they're spatially arranged, how they're connected to each other. And in our example before, the object relative position was near the top of the object. And then the idea is that ensembles of neurons with tuning for different kinds of parts at different positions could group together. Their combined activity or their pattern of activity could represent any object made out of the parts that they signal. And that's diagrammed here for a human body. The idea is that a human body could be represented in terms of component cylinders equating to the torso, the arms, the legs, and the head, and then a more detailed structure, more detailed part structure could be nested within that overall representation. So configural coding was originally proposed, and it's a popular idea because it addresses all three goals that we've mentioned as important aspects of the transformation from images into useful information. So first of all, compression. This kind of representation potentially compresses a shape like a human body into just dozens of signals that correspond to parts that we would name for a human body. So that's a vast compression compared to the tens or hundreds of thousands of photoreceptors that were activated originally to represent a human body. It provides explicit representation of object structure, explicit representation of parts and how they're arranged and how they're connected. Explicit in the sense that it's easy to read. It's easy to interpret the signal from the previous example neuron as representing a sharp convex point near the top of the shape. Configural coding is also potentially very stable because part position is represented in an object-centered reference frame. So the idea is that these neurons don't respond to a particular part of the eye reference frame, a particular part of the retina or retinotopic space. They respond to a particular part of object-centered space, like the top or the right or the bottom or the left. And if that's true, then if this human figure changes position on the retina or changes size, that's okay, because the representation of where the head is relative to where the torso is would remain the same. And this figure here shows how that works in V4, even on the relatively small scale of V4 receptive field. So this is a different example V4 neuron, studied with the same set of shapes, not shown here. But for this neuron, responses were driven by sharp convexity off to the upper left. So you've got strong responses to these stimuli. You've got weak responses to this stimuli, which is almost exactly the same, but it lacks the sharp convexity. But the real point here is that you can change the retinotopic position of the stimulus off to the right, left, top, or bottom of the cell's receptive field, and you still get a consistent response. And you can't get any response by moving the sharp points on this stimulus to different parts of the receptive field. And then this part of the figure down here shows how the cell is actually tuned for the upper right position of this sharp convexity. So you have the strongest responses, that is the darkest backgrounds, for stimuli that have a sharp convexity at the upper left. And then as you gradually move that part of the shape away from the upper left, response gradually goes down. So as I said, the idea to configural coding is that you have an ensemble of neurons signaling constituent parts and their positions, and that gives you a major compression of shape information. And this figure here shows how a large number of V4 neurons with different kinds of tuning can do precisely that. That is, the pattern of activity across those neurons can represent all the different parts of a shape and where those parts are. So the example shape here is this one, which was one of the shapes shown here. This neuron was tuned for sharp convexity near the top of the object, so it gave a strong response to this shape. And in this analysis, each neuron's tuning function was weighted by the strength of its response to that shape. So if this neuron is responding at a high rate, it's saying that the thing that it's tuned for is present. So it responds at a high rate to this stimulus, and then that contributes to this peak in the population activity profile shown here. Other neurons are tuned for concavities off at the upper right or the upper left, and they contribute to these peaks down here. Other neurons contribute to the peaks here and here that represent these less sharp convexities off to the left and right. So altogether, you see that this shape is encoded across the V4 population in terms of the shape and position of its constituent contour fragments. And you can actually take this representation without any information about the original shape and more or less reconstruct the original shape just based on the neural response rates, showing that this is actually a viable code for representing shape. So the next stage we'll talk about beyond V4 is TEO. So this is one synapse removed from V4 neurons. TEO neurons receive inputs from a number of V4 neurons. They have larger receptive fields as a result. So they tend to frequently in natural images, their receptive fields, which can be on the order of 10 or 15 degrees of visual angle, are going to encompass not only more than just a single orientation or more than a couple of orientations. They'll encompass completely different parts of a shape. And so how would you compress information on this scale? So TE neurons compress shape information further by responding to combinations of shape fragments that are not necessarily connected on the same shape. And this is an example. So this is based, again, on an experiment in which lots of shapes are presented, and the tuning of the neuron is derived by analyzing the responses to all those shapes. But after that analysis, it turns out that for this single neuron in TEO, it's somewhat responsive to shapes that have a concavity facing towards the lower right, and somewhat responsive to shapes that have a concavity facing towards the upper right, and even more responsive to shapes that have both of those concavities. So it's a neuron that's representing two contour fragments in a shape that together make this sort of narrowing or neck structure that's oriented diagonally. And the other interesting thing about what's shown here is that the initial response of the shape to these stimuli that just have the one concavity, these stimuli that just have the other concavity, and these stimuli that have both concavities is roughly linear. That is, there's a small response to these shapes, there's a small response to these shapes, and then the response to these shapes that have both is roughly a linear sum of these two responses. But then as time goes on and there's more network processing of the signals coming up from V4, these responses drop out and you're left with a signal only for the shapes that have both of these contour fragments. So this is another step in explicit coding, another one of our goals. In the beginning of the response, you have this linear summation, and that produces an ambiguous signal. So the neuron could be responding to one concavity, it could be responding to the other concavity, or it could be responding to both. But after the network settles down through recursive interactions between neurons, those responses go away, and now the cell produces an explicit, unambiguous signal only for the combination of these two parts. So another example of a signal becoming more explicit, easier to read, more useful for downstream neurons. Also, this just emphasizes the idea that one of the things that the visual system is doing to make representations more stable is to transform the spatial coordinate system from the original retinotopic coordinates into object-centered coordinates. And this just highlights how sensitive this neuron that responded to a combination of these two concavities that are highlighted in green here. Strong responses to stimuli that have those two concavities off to the left side of the object, and very weak responses to stimuli that have those concavities off to the right of the object. So these are relatively small stimuli, so that's only a shift of 1 or 2 degrees, just a small part of a neuron's receptive field, and not shown here, but the neuron remains responsive to these stimuli and not to these stimuli across that receptive field. So it's very clear tuning for object-centered position rather than the original retinotopic coordinates that cells, for example in V1, were sensitive in.
Question.
Yes?
So the neuron is more responsive to two stimuli coming together. How many stimuli do most neurons respond to? They respond to a maximum of 2, or?
So do you mean how many shape fragments do they respond to? So it changes as you go forward. It isn't something I was really going to cover, but once you get down into TE, and it partially depends on how you're measuring fragments of shape, but in TE, if you're measuring contour or surface fragments, it can be on the order of 3, 4, or 5. Or at least that's what analyses so far suggest. As things get more complex, you need more experimental power to really decide whether the equations you're fitting that have more and more variables are really valid. But actually, what you say brings up an important point. So you could imagine that this process could continue to the point where neurons would represent enough parts that a neuron would actually respond to a particular shape and no other shape. And that doesn't happen, at least based on things so far. The representation of shape remains parts-based, but it's sort of in between, representation in terms of individual parts and representation of entire shapes. The most efficient seems to be something in between, where individual neurons represent configurations of parts, and potentially configurations that are commonly found in the natural world. For example, a narrow neck-like structure is something that's commonly found in the natural world. So going beyond TEO, we get to TE, which is all of this cortex in the lower part of the temporal lobe. And here, receptive fields are large enough to encompass entire objects. How do you compress information even further on this scale? Well, one way is to represent configurations of multiple parts so that you've got more information coming from each neuron. And then what was specifically posed in this version of parts-based representation was the idea that ultimately the parts for representing objects would not be 2D pieces of the image, but they would be 3D volume occupying segments of real world objects. So that, for example, a human figure would be represented in terms of these cylinders. So this is potentially another very strong compression strategy in the sense that we don't live in a world in which all objects are blobby and potato-like. We live in a world where particularly the objects that we care about, that have a lot of behavioral relevance for us, like human bodies and animal bodies and trees and plants, etc. They're not just blobby, they tend to have elongation along axes. They tend to have tubular construction. They have legs and arms and torsos and branches, etc. So a way that theorists have talked about for a long time for representing that kind of shape is in terms of the sort of stick figure equivalent of what the surface of the shape really describes. So if you were going to reduce a human form to a stick figure, you'd have a stick for the arms, you'd have sticks for the legs, one for the torso, one for the head. And basically the idea to this particular version of configural coding is that many objects, like bodies, are represented in terms of these elongated parts, in terms of the orientation of their medial axes or skeletal elements, and in terms of the relative position of those medial axes, and in terms of the curvature of those medial axes. So here's an experiment that shows that that is indeed the case in TE. So in this experiment, again based on showing lots of shapes to individual neurons, this is all results for a single neuron. In this case, in order to explore the entire domain of three-dimensional shape, the experiment begins with randomly constructed three-dimensional shapes. They're three-dimensional in the sense that shading cues, which you can see here, confer a sense of three-dimensionality. And then also binocular disparity was used in the experiment, the same kind of cue based on slightly different positions in the two eyes that 3D movies are based on. But of course you can't see that here. So the experiment starts out with a first generation of randomly created stimuli, but then in order to shift sampling into the range of three-dimensional shape that the neuron is responsive to, higher response stimuli from early generations produce multiple partially morphed descendants in future generations. And that continues through generations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., so that by this point, lots of samples are testing responses in the actual response range of the neuron instead of wasting a lot of time getting no response at all. It may be obvious, but I should have mentioned that now for this diagram, high responses are represented by a red background behind the stimulus icon, and low responses are represented by a black background. And another aspect of this experiment is that the whole stimulus evolution is divided into two lineages. So this is one lineage, this is another lineage. There's no crossover between the two. So that's a way of looking at high response stimuli across the two lineages and fitting functions that describe both sets of responses, and then doing cross-validation to show that the two lineages converged on the same result. And I won't talk about details of analysis, but what's shown here is high response shapes from one lineage and high response shapes from the other lineage. You can see that globally these shapes are different, but analysis shows that they have a common medial axis configuration consisting of 2 legs near the front of the object, and then a torso part, and then a branch heading off towards the left or towards the front of the object. So TE neurons compress object information, particularly information about objects that have elongated parts with medial axis coding of elongated structures. But most TE neurons combine medial axis tuning with tuning for surface shape as well. So they preserve more than just stick figure shape. They preserve some detail about the surface shape around those medial axes. So these are 3 different neurons, and for each neuron what's shown is responses to a high response stimulus, a lower response stimulus, and a very low response stimulus. And what's done in the change across these columns is keeping the same medial axis structure, but then changing the surface structure that surrounds it. So this is a way of distinguishing whether responses are absolutely consistent and faithful for medial axis structure, or whether they're also sensitive to surface structure. And this neuron here is an example that's pretty consistent across many different variations of surface structure, as long as the medial axis shape was the same. And in fact, it gave one of its strongest responses to a shape that really looked just like a stick figure. But for most neurons, they are sensitive to surface structure as well. And in both these examples, you can see that responses to shapes that have very little volume to them are low, and the high responses are to shapes that have substantial volume in one or more parts of the shape. So we've been talking about configural coding in the ventral pathway, and now I'm going to mention an alternative theoretical idea that's been around for a long time, the idea of coding in similarity space or in exemplar space. Entirely different idea. In exemplar coding, each neuron actually represents information about an entire shape. And the information it represents is how similar that shape is to some other shape that is based on visual learning in the past. So the cartoon to explain this, shown here, proposes the idea that animal shapes would be represented in this kind of similarity space. And what's imagined is that through visual learning, you might have had exposure to pigs, to camels, to goats, to other animal shapes. But maybe you've never seen a giraffe before. It's the first time in your life you'd see a giraffe. But your representation of that giraffe would be based on its similarity to these other familiar shapes. So a giraffe is fairly similar to a camel, so the neurons that are responsive to camels would respond a lot to the giraffe. Less similar to goats, so there would be lower responses from neurons in this part of the space, lower responses from neurons in this part of the space. But the idea overall is that a new shape is encoded by the set of responses across many different neurons that represent these familiar exemplars that represent the differences between goats and pigs and camels, for example. Yep?
How do the base shapes get encoded?
So what's imagined here is that in the course of visual learning, you're exposed to these shapes, and then through an unspecified mechanism, you start you have neurons that start to respond to those shapes. So what's imagined is if you see a goat many times, then you're going to jack up synaptic weights for all the inputs that are activated when you see a goat, and you'll have neurons that are responsive to that pattern of inputs. But it's an unspecified, magic mechanism. Right. So exemplar coding like this actually involves a drastic compression of information, because now each neuron represents something about every part of the shape, and every neuron that you add to your population is adding a new dimension of coding. And any point in the space of neural dimensions created by that is potentially a different shape with a different set of similarities to things in the space. So what we've discussed up to this point in this lecture clearly shows that exemplar coding didn't turn out to be the way objects are represented in the ventral pathway, because you never get to the point of neurons that are sensitive to the entire shape of an object. They always respond to a number of shapes that share some configuration of parts. But it turns out that exemplar coding is important for at least one category of shapes that are very important to humans and to other primates, and that is faces. So faces are a very different category. They're of extremely high behavioral relevance, so much so that the human brain and the brains of other primates have this system of 6 patches running through the length of the ventral pathway that are dedicated just to processing face information, processing the identity of faces, the pose of faces, etc. So faces, if you think about it, they look really different. Everybody's face looks really different to us, but they're geometrically extremely similar. And the differences between two faces are based on minute structural changes that mean a lot to us, but only because we've developed this incredible visual expertise for distinguishing and remembering thousands of faces. So faces, again, in terms of their sort of coarse part structure, are all very much the same, but they have a large number of composite differences in the exact shapes and the exact positions of fragments like the eyebrows, the eyes, the nose, the nostrils, the lips, etc. And that's a situation in which similarity space or exemplar coding is potentially useful, because you've got things that differ only in very composite global ways, and composite global differences are exactly what exemplar coding is made to represent. There have been lots of psychophysical experiments that suggest that neural coding of faces is centered in some way on the geometric average of all the faces that we experience in our lifetime. So that any given neuron is going to represent a continuum of faces with its firing rate, a continuum that goes through the center of this space. So at one end of its dimensionality, you might get 0 spikes per second, and that might be very broad faces. And then the response of the neuron would increase as the face became less broad and closer to the average, and then it would get even higher as the face went in the opposite direction and became very narrow. And so experiments show that this is in fact what happens in face patches for neurons in face patches. They are tuned along axes that sort of represent a morph line for faces in which various characteristics are changing in concert, so that you go from one extreme through the average face to what is sort of the opposite extreme, from broad to narrow, from eyes high in the face to low in the face, etc. This is an example figure for 4 neurons showing tuning of those neurons to faces arranged in this kind of space here, and you can see that the extremes of responses, the highest responses, are indeed away from the central face. One thing that this kind of similarity space encoding centered on an average explains is the, explains is the power of caricatures. It's a well-known observation that it's actually easier to recognize somebody from their caricature than it is to recognize an actual photograph of them. So in a caricature, what you're basically doing is taking all the dimensions in face space that characterize that person and distinguish that person from everybody else, and you're going further out along those dimensions. You're making the neurons involved fire at a higher rate. You're getting to a point in face space that's further away from other faces. So there's a question?
What distinguishes a face as a face? Like, what characteristics of a face do you have to remove in order for it to stop being recognized? That's one. Or like.
Well, like the rest of human vision, face recognition is very robust to difficult conditions. So occlusion, like of the mouth or the eyes, is one kind of difficult condition. I mean, I've never read anything specific about the psychophysics of how well people recognize somebody if you cover their mouth, or how well if you cover your eyes. But you know, subjectively and anecdotally, obviously, different parts of a person can be covered. This happens all the time, and you can still recognize them. So there's no single set of parts that is necessary under any given conditions. Subsets of parts can suffice for recognizing a face.
Does this pattern hold true for false recognitions of faces? Like if you see a face in a random pattern, just because it happens to be constructed vaguely like a face, do these neural pathways still fire the same way?
So your hypothetical is that if you had random noise, but you had something that sort of looked like a face, would it drive these neurons? Yes, definitely. So, I mean, you can drive these neurons with cartoon faces that consist of nothing except a circle and 2 dot eyes and a line mouth, but not as strongly as you could drive them if the stimulus was perfected for the characteristics that they're actually encoding. Okay, so that's really the end of everything I was going to tell you about. I may have made it sound like we understand a lot about vision, but in fact we don't. This is extremely rudimentary knowledge about how an incredibly powerful system works. We have some idea of how some aspects of visual stimuli are represented, but we know next to nothing about the algorithms that actually carry out the transformation from images to these better representations that are more useful. And if we knew those algorithms, we could actually use them to construct better machine vision. We don't know how those algorithms develop through learning. We don't know how the visual system represents all the minute detail that you can see in a picture like this. So everything that I've described would still give you only a crude representation of anything in this picture, but obviously you see exquisite detail in this picture. We don't know how the visual system derives information about material properties, about the physics of a scene, or how it puts together all the information about the objects and surfaces in a scene into the gestalt that is so easy for you to appreciate here. So that's it. Any other questions? Okay, thanks.